Welcome to Eerie Tales for Restful Sleep, where soothing rain meets gentle horror for peaceful nights. Subscribe, like, comment, and share to join our brave night owl community. Sleep tight, if you dare. The Vermont cabin, where the walls don't end. What if the most terrifying thing about an old cabin in the woods isn't what you hear at night, but what you can't explain in the morning? Imagine renting a place so isolated that the nearest neighbor is half a mile away. The snow cuts you off from the world, and the only thing moving in the darkness is something that shouldn't exist at all. That's exactly what happened to one woodworker who thought he was escaping the chaos of city life for a few months of peace and productivity. Instead, he found himself at the center of a haunting that defies every rule of reality and left behind evidence that still baffles anyone who hears his story. It started with the kind of sounds you expect in an old house: the creak of timber, the groan of pipes, the wind rattling the eaves. Vermont winters are notorious for making buildings talk, and the first night in the cabin near Stowe, that's all he thought it was. Just the old woods settling, nothing more. But by the third night, the noises had changed. They weren't random anymore. They were footsteps, slow, deliberate, and always overhead, tracing a path from one end of the attic to the other, as if someone was pacing out a ritual in the darkness above. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe a raccoon, maybe a squirrel, maybe just his imagination. But the footsteps always started at the same time, 2:30 a.m., right when the world outside was at its coldest and quietest. They began near the chimney, then moved across the attic to the far wall, the north wall, the one that never seemed to warm up, no matter how high he cranked the thermostat. That wall was always cold, even when the rest of the cabin was toasty. It was as if the winter outside was leaking in through some invisible crack, or as if the wall itself belonged to another season, another world. The attic access was a pull-down ladder in the hallway ceiling, and after the first night of footsteps, he'd locked it from below with a heavy padlock. He was meticulous, careful, and absolutely certain that no one could be up there. But the sounds continued, night after night, always the same path, always the same time. On the fourth morning, he found something that made his skin crawl. His chisel tools he cared for with almost religious devotion had been moved, not scattered, not knocked over, but arranged with purpose. They formed arrows on the workshop floor, all pointing toward the main cabin. The grooves they'd scraped into the old pine boards were deep enough to catch a fingernail, as if someone or something had pressed them down with unnatural force. He spent that day installing motion-activated cameras in the workshop, determined to catch whoever was playing tricks. But the next morning, the footage showed nothing. 4 hours of static darkness between 2:27 and 6:31 a.m. The timestamp never jumped. The recording never stopped. Just a blank, unbroken void. Yet his coping saw, his marking gauge, and his mortise chisel had been arranged on the floor again, this time pointing directly at the cabin's north wall. The pattern continued for a week. Every morning, different tools formed arrows, always pointing to that same cold wall, the one where frost formed on the inside during bitter nights. Despite the insulation, he could see through the gaps in the pine paneling. He started sleeping in the workshop, telling himself it was to catch whoever was responsible. But the footsteps in the attic continued, even without him there to hear them. He knew because he set up a recorder. The playback revealed the same measured pace, the same route from chimney to cold wall, over and over. But something else emerged in the recordings, sound like breathing, or wind through a narrow space, coming from inside the walls themselves. By the second week, he couldn't take it anymore. He had to know what was behind that north wall. He waited for daylight, as if the sun could protect him from whatever he might find. The insulation came away too easily, as if it had been removed and replaced before. Behind it, set into what should have been the exterior wall, was a small door. Not a proper door, more like a hatch, maybe 2 feet square, with iron hinges that belonged to a much older style of craftsmanship than the 1950s cabin. His hands shook as he pried it open. Cold air rushed out, colder than the December morning, colder than any air had a right to be. The space beyond was impossible. From outside, he'd measured the cabin's footprint multiple times. This wall was the exterior wall. There was no room for any space beyond it, yet his flashlight beam penetrated at least 6 feet into darkness before hitting another wall. The wooden floor of the hidden space was covered in dust X for footprints. They led from the hatch to the far wall and back, over and over, creating a worn path. But the strangest part was how the prints seemed to emerge from the wood itself at the far wall, as if someone had walked through solid matter. He should have left then, packed his tools, broken the lease, driven back to Boston. But obsession took hold. He measured everything. The cabin's exterior was exactly 32 feet long. The interior was 32 feet long, yet that hidden space extended 6 feet beyond what should have been the outer wall. He checked from outside again and again. Snow had begun to fall, and his footprints circled the cabin like the orbits of an unstable planet. After he opened the hatch, the arrows began appearing in the main cabin. He'd wake to find his books arranged in formation on the coffee table, pointing toward his bedroom. The kitchen knives would be laid out on the counter, all indicating the same direction. Once he found every piece of furniture, couch, chairs, dining table rotated to face his bedroom door. He hadn't heard a thing. By the 3rd week, he stopped sleeping altogether. Instead, he sat in his bedroom with his back to the wall, watching the door. Sometimes he'd hear the footsteps directly overhead, even though his bedroom was in a single-story section of the cabin. When he checked, fresh footprints would mark the dust in the hidden space, always ending at that impossible far wall. The turning point came when he discovered the photographs. He'd been documenting everything obsessively, the tool arrangements, the footprints, the impossible room. When he reviewed the photos on his laptop, he noticed something in the hidden space images. In each photo, if he enhanced the brightness and contrast, a figure appeared in the darkness. Just a suggestion of a shape tall, thin, pressed against that far wall. In successive photos taken minutes apart, it had moved closer to the hatch. He went back to check the space. No figure, but new footprints led from the far wall to the hatch. And for the first time, they continued out into the cabin proper. The dusty impressions traced a path along the hallway floor, growing fainter with each step until they stopped at his bedroom door. That night, he heard breathing that wasn't his. It came from inside the walls, a slow, patient rhythm that seemed to move through the wooden studs and insulation like water through pipes. He followed the sound with growing horror as it traced the same path as those footprints from the north wall. Along the hallway, stopping just outside his bedroom, he grabbed his phone to call someone, anyone, but there was no signal. There hadn't been for days, he realized. The snow had been falling steadily, and the access road was certainly blocked by now. His truck, when he checked through the window, was buried up to its door handles. The breathing inside the walls grew louder. He wrote his account by lamplight, his back pressed against his bedroom's south wall, as far from that cold north wall as he could get. The arrows had changed. That morning, every tool in his workshop, every book and piece of furniture in the cabin, even the fallen pine needles on the porch, all pointed to where he was sitting right then. The footprints in the hidden space had multiplied. When he checked an hour earlier, the dust showed dozens of paths, all leading from that impossible far wall to the hatch, all fresh, all made while he was standing right there, watching nothing make them. The temperature kept dropping, not outside, inside the walls. He could see his breath, but the thermometer read 68 degrees. Frost was forming on the inside of the windows, but only in patterns that looked almost like someone pressing their face against the glass from within the pane itself. He realized something about the cabin's geometry that made his chest tighten with panic. If that hidden space extended 6 feet beyond where it should, and if something could walk through the far wall, then maybe the walls weren't boundaries at all. Maybe they were just markers, thin membranes between here and somewhere else, somewhere colder. The breathing in the walls had words in it now. Not English, not any language he recognized, but repetitive, rhythmic, like a chant or prayer. It was coming from all the walls simultaneously, creating a harmony that made his teeth ache. He checked the photos again. The figure was clearer in the latest ones. It wasn't standing against the far wall anymore. It was halfway through it, as if the wood was liquid. Its face, if it had a face, was turned toward the camera, toward where he was standing. In the very last photo, taken just before he sealed the hatch with every nail he could find, it was smiling. The footsteps above had stopped. For the first time in weeks, the attic was silent, but he could hear breathing directly behind the wall he was leaning against. Slow, patient, waiting. The frost on the windows was spreading, forming letters he didn't want to read. His tools in the workshop were scraping against the floor. He could hear them rearranging themselves again. He decided to try to reach his truck. The snow might be deep, but staying felt like sinking into something that wore the shape of a cabin, but wasn't one anymore. Maybe never was. He'd looked up the elderly woman who rented it to him when he still had signal. She'd died in 1987. The wall behind him was getting colder, cold enough that his shirt was sticking to it with frost. When he pulled away, he could see his outline in ice on the wood, like a shadow frozen in place. Inside that outline, the wood looked different, older, like it had been there much longer than the rest of the cabin. He could see his breath, but now it wasn't dissipating. It hung in the air, forming shapes that looked almost like arrows pointing back toward the wall. The hidden space shouldn't exist, but it did. The footprints shouldn't appear on their own, but they did. And now he understood that the arrows were never threats. They were invitations, directions, the same way you'd mark a trail through the woods so someone could follow, or so something could follow you back. The breathing in the walls had synchronized with his. When he held his breath, it held too. When he gasped, it gasped, but always a half second behind, like an echo, or like something learning to mimic. He was leaving. He had to. The walls were all cold now, all of them frosted from the inside. His footprints on the floor were filling with that same frost, marking where he'd been like a map, bleeding from his bedroom to the front door. Just like the footprints in the hidden space led from the far wall to here, he understood now. The cabin wasn't haunted. It wasn't cursed. It was just built in the wrong place, built part way into somewhere else, and something that lived in that somewhere else had been trying to cross over. Using the paths we make footprints, tool marks, even our breath in the air as bridges. The front door was frozen shut. He used his shoulder, all his weight, but the ice was on the inside of the wood, in the grain itself. Through the frosted window, he could see his truck, his escape, just 20 feet away. Behind him, he heard footsteps. Not from the attic, from his bedroom, slow, shuffling, following the path he'd just walked. Following his footprints in the frost, the door cracked, splintered, finally gave way. The cold outside was warm compared to what was behind him. He ran through the snow, not looking back, his breath coming in clouds that hung in the air too long, forming arrows pointing back toward the cabin. He made it to the truck. The engine turned over on the third try. In the rearview mirror, the cabin looked normal. Warm light in the windows, smoke from the chimney, inviting, like somewhere you'd want to return. But in the reflection of his rearview mirror, in just the right light, he could see footprints in the snow beside his own. Following his path, stopping where the truck was parked, he drove. Writing this at a rest stop 50 miles from Stowe, he swore he'd never go back. But sometimes, when he breathed on cold glass, the condensation formed patterns that looked like arrows, all pointing north, pointing back, and last night, in his Boston apartment, he heard familiar footsteps above his top-floor unit where there is no floor above, where there shouldn't be any space at all. The Idaho smart cabin. When technology lets the wrong thing in, what if the very technology designed to keep you safe became the first thing to betray you? In the age of smart homes, we trust our devices to watch over us, to alert us to danger, to keep the world at bay. But what happens when the sensors start detecting things that shouldn't be there, when the data itself becomes haunted? This is the story of a remote rental cabin in the Idaho wilderness, a place where the only thing more unsettling than the silence is the way the smart home system refuses to let its owner forget what's inside. It's a haunting that unfolds not in flickering candlelight, but in the cold blue glow of a phone screen at 3:47 a.m. And it's a story that will make you question every notification you've ever received in the dead of night. It began, as these things often do, with a single, inexplicable alert. The owner was asleep in his city apartment, miles away from the cabin he'd bought as an investment property. The place was supposed to be empty, no guests, no cleaners, no one for miles around. But at 3:47 a.m., his phone chimed, dragging him from a dream he couldn't quite remember. The screen glowed with a message from the security app. Smart lock engaged. Cabin occupied. His heart hammered in his chest. The last guests had checked out 3 days ago. The next booking wasn't until Friday. He fumbled with the app, pulling up the live camera feeds. Every room was empty, just furniture and shadows. Nothing moving, nothing out of place. But the occupancy sensors told a different story. The hallway motion detector was registering movement, steady, methodical pacing. 7 steps forward, pause, 7 steps back. The pattern repeated with mechanical precision, each cycle taking exactly 23 seconds. He watched the counter tick upward. 47 passes, 48, 49. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe a glitch, maybe a draft, maybe a mouse. But the pattern was too perfect, too human. He threw on yesterday's clothes, grabbed his keys, and headed for the door. The drive would take an hour in good conditions, but the mountain roads at night were treacherous. As he navigated the winding asphalt, his phone continued its barrage of notifications. Door sensor triggered, window sensor triggered, temperature dropping in the master bedroom. 68º, 65º, 61º. The cabin materialized from the darkness like a ship emerging from fog. Its cedar exterior absorbed the moonlight rather than reflecting it. From the outside, it looked exactly as it should. Dark windows, locked doors, the porch light casting its familiar amber circle. But the app insisted someone was inside, walking those same 7 steps over and over. He killed the engine and sat for a moment, listening. The forest pressed in from all sides, pine trees swaying in a wind he couldn't feel. The smart lock recognized his phone and clicked open before he could touch the handler. Convenience feature that now felt invasive, as if the cabin itself was inviting him in. The entryway was cold, far colder than the app had indicated. His breath misted in the air, and he could see frost forming on the edges of the welcome mat. The hallway stretched ahead, lit only by the pale green glow of the smoke detector's lids. That's when he saw them, the handprints. They started at shoulder height on the left wall, wet and glistening in the dim light. Each print was perfectly formed, fingers splayed wide, as if someone had been feeling their way along the corridor. They followed the exact path indicated by the motion sensor's 7 steps forward, ending at the bathroom door, then switching to the opposite wall for the return journey. He reached for the light switch, and the moment fluorescent brightness flooded the space, the handprints vanished. Not dried, not faded, simply gone, as if they had never existed. He stood there, breathing hard, trying to rationalize what he'd seen. Condensation, maybe. Some trick of the emergency lighting. He flicked the switch off. The handprints returned immediately, darker now, dripping steadily onto the hardwood floor. The drops made no sound as they fell, pooling into shapes that looked almost like footprints before dissolving into the grain of the wood. His phone buzzed. The app showed a new reservation, dated 3 weeks ago, for a guest whose name was just a string of numbers, 47231-923. The same numbers as the motion sensor pattern. He scrolled through the booking history, and his stomach dropped. Dozens of reservations he'd never seen before, all with numerical names, all 4 dates that had already passed. Some were from months ago, others from years before he'd even bought the property. The temperature in the hallway plummeted. Ice crystals began forming on the windows, spreading in fractal patterns across the glass. Through the frost, he could see something moving outside, a dark shape pacing, the tree line with the same mechanical precision as the sensor readings. 7 steps forward, pause, 7 steps back. He forced himself to move deeper into the cabin, following the wet handprints that seemed to pulse with each step he took. They led to the living room, where the prints climbed the walls, circling the framed photographs he'd hung to give the place a homey feel. Each picture showed the cabin at different stages of renovation, a visual timeline of his investment. But in the darkness, with only his phone's flashlight for illumination, the images looked wrong. The cabin in the photos was identical to his, but the backgrounds were different. Instead of pine forest, there were other structures, buildings that shouldn't exist. Architectural impossibilities that hurt to look at directly. And in each photo, barely visible in the windows, was the same figure, tall, indistinct, standing perfectly still. He aimed his phone at one picture, zooming in on the figure. The image pixelated, reformed, pixelated again. For just a moment, he could swear he saw a face human-like, but stretched, as if someone had grabbed a normal face and pulled it like taffy. Then his phone crashed, the screen going black before rebooting to the home screen. When the app reloaded, the reservation history had changed again. Now there were hundreds of bookings, overlapping dates, creating an impossible calendar where multiple guests occupied the same space simultaneously. The names were all numbers now, some matching dates, others forming patterns he couldn't decipher. The earliest reservation was from 1987, 15 years before the cabin was built. A notification popped up. New guest has checked in. The front door's smart lock engaged behind him with a definitive click. He spun around, but the entryway was empty. The wet handprints, however, had multiplied. They covered both walls now, overlapping and interweaving, creating a tunnel of dripping impressions that led back toward the bedrooms. The moisture wasn't water. It was too thick, too dark, moving with a viscosity that reminded him of motor oil, but smelled of ozone and copper. The motion sensors were going haywire. Every room showed movement simultaneously, impossible patterns of presence that suggested dozens of occupants walking through walls, through furniture, through each other. The app's interface glitched, showing room temperatures that couldn't exist. Absolute 0 in the bathroom, 500 in the kitchen. Numbers that flickered and changed faster than he could read them. He tried to call for help, but his phone had no signal. The Wi-Fi was connected, showing full bars, but every number he dialed went straight to a recording. The tenant you are trying to reach is not available. Please check your reservation and try again. The handprints began to move, not the hands, making them the prints themselves, sliding along the walls like living things. They maintained their shape, but flowed like liquid, converging on the master bedroom door. He followed, drawn by a compulsion he couldn't explain, his feet matching the 7-step pattern without conscious thought. The bedroom was wrong. The furniture was his, arranged exactly as he'd left it, but the proportions were off. The ceiling was too high, the corners too sharp, the shadows falling in directions that defied the single overhead light. On the bed, the sheets were disturbed, pressed down in the shape of a body that wasn't there or wasn't visible. As he watched, the impression deepened, as if someone was settling into the mattress. The pillow compressed, the blankets pulled back, The app chimed. Guest comfort mode activated. Temperature adjusting to preference. The room began to warm, but not evenly. Pockets of heat and cold created a patchwork of climate zones that made his skin crawl. He could feel breath on his neck, warm, humid exhalations that shouldn't exist. When he turned, nothing was there, but the sensation moved to his cheek, his forehead, circling him like something examining its prey. He stumbled backward, hitting the dresser. The framed photos on top clattered, and one fell, its glass shattering. But instead of scattered shards, the pieces arranged themselves into a pattern, numbers again, the same sequence from the reservations. As he stared, trying to make sense of it, the fragments began to vibrate, humming at a frequency that made his teeth ache. The app showed a message in the guest communication log. Thank you for accepting our extended stay. We have been waiting. The plural hit him like ice water. He looked at the motion sensors again. Reevy looked at the data. The patterns weren't random. They were synchronized, coordinated movements of multiple entities following preset routes through the cabin. The handprints weren't from one set of hands, but dozens, all following the same path, layered on top of each other in a palimpsest of presence. The reservation system crashed and rebooted, showing a new interface he'd never seen before. Instead of dates and names, it displayed something else, coordinates, and a single word repeated over and over: occupied. Every entry was marked occupied, going back decades, centuries, times that made no sense. Future dates, too, stretching forward into years that hadn't happened yet. All of them here in this space, simultaneously present and absent. He ran for the door, but the smart lock wouldn't respond to his phone. The manual override required a code he'd never set, numbers that appeared on the keypad that shouldn't exist, symbols that hurt to perceive, that seemed to shift and writhe under his fingers. The handprints were everywhere now, covering the ceiling, the floor, even appearing on his clothes. Where unseen hands grasped and pulled, the app showed his location, not as the cabin, but as somewhere else, coordinates that placed him simultaneously in thousands of locations, all of them labeled with the same address. His phone rang. The caller ID showed his own number. He answered, hearing his own voice, but distorted, multiplied. Speaking from every corner of the room, checkout time was 40 years ago. You're in violation of the rental agreement. The cabin's lights began to strobe, cycling through spectrums visible and invisible. In the moments of darkness, he could see them, the other tenants. They stood in impossible numbers, occupying the same space without collision, their forms translucent and overlapping. Some were human-shaped but wrong, stretched or compressed by forces he couldn't understand. Others were just suggestions of presence, movements without bodies, intentions without form. They all moved in the same pattern. 7 steps forward, pause. 7 steps back. He felt himself beginning to move with them, his body falling into the rhythm against his will. His phone's screen cracked, displaying reservation after reservation, all of them his. All of them for dates he didn't remember, stays he couldn't recall. The earliest was from before he was born. The latest was after he would die. The smart lock disengaged. The door swung open, revealing not the forest outside, but another hallway identical to the one behind him. The handprints led in both directions, an infinite corridor of wet impressions and mechanical movement. He ran through the door and found himself in the same cabin, but older, newer, different. The renovation photos showed other versions. The cabin burned, rebuilt, destroyed by time, restored by hands that weren't quite human. In each iteration, the same figures stood in the windows, waiting. His phone buzzed one last time. A review had been posted on the rental listing. Excellent stay. The host was very accommodating. We will definitely be returning. We never left. 5 stars. He was still in the cabin, or maybe he never was. The app showed him as both owner and guest, present and absent, checking in and checking out in an endless loop. The handprints followed him wherever he went, but he'd stopped trying to run. Sometimes he saw himself in the security cameras, pacing the hallway, 7 steps forward, pause, 7 steps back. The reservation system showed a new booking for tonight. The name was just numbers, 347-231-923, the same as his phone number if you removed the area code. The check-in time was 3:47 a.m. It was always 3:47 a.m. here. The smart lock was about to engage. Someone was coming, or maybe they were already here. Maybe they'd always been here. Maybe he'd always been here, walking these halls, leaving wet handprints that disappear in the light. He checked the app one more time. There was a message in the host communications. Thank you for providing the space. We needed somewhere to exist. He understood now. The cabin wasn't haunted. It was occupied. Infinitely, eternally occupied by things that need space to be. And he was the host who could never leave, managing a property that exists in states that shouldn't be possible for guests who check in but never truly check out. The motion sensors were still counting. The number kept climbing, but it didn't matter anymore. In the darkness, they all paced together, following the paths worn into reality by repetition and necessity. 7 steps forward, pause, 7 steps back. The rhythm of existence in a place that's simultaneously empty and infinitely full. His phone buzzed. Another booking, another version of himself, probably coming to check on the cabin that shouldn't have anyone in it. He wondered if he'd see the handprints. He wondered if he'd understand before it was too late. He wondered if there was ever a difference between the host and the guest. The smart lock clicked. Someone was here. The haunted radio station echoes that never end. What if the most haunted place in your town wasn't a graveyard or an abandoned house, but a radio station? Not the kind of place you'd expect to find ghosts, just a low-wattage AM station. The kind that plays old country songs and weather reports for a handful of insomniacs and truckers, passing through the night. But what if, in the dead hours between midnight and dawn, the airwaves themselves became a trap, and the voice you heard on the other end of the line was your own calling from a future you can't escape? This is the story of KXNM, a forgotten radio station on the outskirts of Albuquerque, and the midnight DJ who discovered that some broadcasts never end. They just echo, looping through time, pulling in anyone who dares to listen too closely. It started, as these stories often do, with a routine. The DJ had been running the midnight shift for 3 months, long enough to know which floorboards creaked, which dials stuck, and exactly how many seconds of dead air he could risk before the station manager called from his bed, voice thick with sleep and irritation, but not long enough to understand what happened at 2:13 a.m. He discovered it during his second week. The request line, a rotary phone that barely anyone called anymore, would light up at exactly 2:13 a.m. No ring, just the soft glow of the indicator bulb. When he picked up a man's voice, gravelly and distant, would request the same song every time. Play Shadows on the Mesa by Blind Willie Torreon. The first few times, he explained they didn't have that record. The voice would pause, then respond with the same words each time. Check again tomorrow. It'll be there. Of course, it never was. But tonight felt different. The air in the studio hung heavy, despite the October chill seeping through the single-pane windows. His coffee had gone cold, forming an oily film on its surface that reflected the on-air sign like a warning. Through the booth window, the parking lot stretched empty under sodium lights that turned everything the color of old bones. He queued up the next track, some forgettable country ballad that filled the 2 a.m. slot hand, leaned back in his chair. The springs protested with a sound like distant laughter. That's when he noticed the reel-to-reel recorder in the corner, its spools turning, despite being disconnected for years. The maintenance guy said it was broken beyond repair. Just another piece of equipment, waiting to be hauled away when the budget allowed. Yet, there it was, recording nothing onto magnetic tape that shouldn't exist. He approached it slowly, his reflection multiplying in the dark windows that lined the studio. Each step felt monitored, as if the very air was taking notes. The tape was moving at exactly 7.5 inches per second broadcast standard. When he pressed the monitor button, static filled his headphones, then cleared. It was his voice, but wrong, pitched slightly lower, speaking words he hadn't said. And that was Moonlight Serenade by Glenn Miller. Coming up on 213, we have a special request that's been waiting 47 years to be played. But first, a word of caution to our listeners, to myself. Don't look at the studio window. Not yet. Not until the condensation spells it out completely. His actual voice, live on air, was discussing tomorrow's weather. The disconnect made his teeth ache. He rewound the tape. The voice's voice continued backward, revealing more. The parking lot isn't empty. It never was. The sodium lights just can't illuminate what's standing there, waiting for permission to enter. The door will knock 3 times at 2:27. Under no circumstances should you. The tape snapped. The loose end whipped around the spool like a frantic snake before going still. 2:09 a.m. He returned to the booth, trying to maintain professional composure for the 0 to 3 listeners who might be tuned in. His hands shook as he introduced the next song, something about lost love and dusty roads. Through the window, condensation began forming on the outside of the glass, despite the dry desert air. At first, it was random, just moisture beating in the cold. Then patterns emerged. They started at the corner, barely visible. D, then O, then N. He forced himself to look away, focusing on the console. The VU meters danced to the music, their needles swaying like metronomes counting down to something inevitable. In his peripheral vision, more letters appeared on the glass, but he didn't read them. Couldn't read them. Wouldn't. 2:11 a.m. The air in the studio shifted, became dense like before a thunderstorm. His ears popped. The fluorescent lights stopped flickering and burned steady too bright, casting everything in harsh relief. Every scratch on the console, every coffee stain on the desk. Every imperfection stood out like an accusation. The country song ended. Dead air. He scrambled for the next track, anything to fill the silence, but his fingers wouldn't cooperate. They hovered over the buttons, like he was trying to remember a language he'd never learned. That's when he heard it. The echo. It was subtle at first, barely a delay. His voice from the speakers announcing the station ID. Followed by the same words a half-second later, quieter, from somewhere else in the building. But as he listened, he realized the echo wasn't following his words. It was preceding them. KXNM, broadcasting from the high desert, the echo said. Then he heard himself say it. The time is now, 2:12 a.m., the echo announced. His mouth opened, formed the words involuntarily. He wasn't speaking, he was repeating. 2:13 a.m., the request line's bulb glowed. His hand reached for it, against his will, muscles moving with practiced familiarity. The receiver was cold against his ear, cold enough to burn. Play Shadows on the Mesa by Blind Willie Torion, the voice said, but this time he recognized it. It was his. Older, rougher, but undeniably his. We don't have that record, he responded, the words automatic. Check again tomorrow. It'll be there. A pause. It's been there for 47 years, waiting. You've played it every night at this time. You just don't remember yet. The line went dead. He set the receiver down and turned to the record library. There, between Willie Nelson and Tammy Wynette, was an album he'd never seen before. The cover was water-damaged. The vinyl inside, probably unplayable. The label read, Shadows on the Mesa by Blind Willie Torion. Recorded October 1976, the same month, according to the faded notation on the sleeve, that the previous midnight DJ disappeared without explanation. His hands moved without his permission, pulling the record out, placing it on the turntable. The needle dropped, and instead of music, there was a recording. If you're hearing this, it means the loop has started again. I'm sorry. I tried to warn myself yourself, but the transmission only goes one way, forward into the past, backward into the future. The echo you're hearing isn't an echo. It's the original broadcast. You're the echo. You've always been the echo. The voice was definitely his, but weathered by years he hadn't lived. The thing in the parking lot has been waiting since 1976. It needs permission to enter, but not from you. From the you that hasn't happened yet. The you that's already knocked on the door. Don't look at the window. The message it's spelling isn't a warning. It's an invitation. Once you read it completely, once you understand what you're agreeing to, the timeline locks. He glanced at the window involuntarily. The condensation had spread, letters covering the entire surface. He could make out his name, the time 2:27 a.m., something else, instructions, directions, a contract written in moisture that shouldn't exist. The only way to break the cycle is to not play the next part of this recording. Let the station go to dead air. Let them fire you. Leave town. Forget this place exists. But you won't, because I didn't. Because in 47 years, you'll be making this recording, hoping someone yourself finally listens. The record continued spinning, but silent now, waiting. He could lift the needle, walk out, drive until the desert swallowed the memory of this place. But through the soundproof walls, he heard something. Footsteps in the hallway. Slow, measured, approaching the studio door. They stopped just outside. 2:24 a.m., the condensation on the window shifted, rearranged. The letters became clearer, more insistent. His name appeared again, larger, and below it, a single word, witness. The echo of his voice started again, speaking tomorrow's words today. And that was Shadows on the Mesa, a request from a long-time listener. Speaking of time, have you ever wondered if the present is just the past's way of becoming the future? Or if we're all just recordings playing out our parts, while the real performance happened years ago? He was saying these words now, live, but he didn't mean to. They were being pulled from him. The footsteps resumed, closer. To 26 a.m., he stood, the chair rolling backward into shadow. Every instinct screamed to run, but his legs carried him toward the studio door instead. Through the small window, the hallway was dark, except for the red exit sign at the far end. Its light didn't reach the space directly outside the door. Something was standing there, shape that didn't quite fit the darkness, like a person-shaped hole in reality. It raised what might be an arm. 2:27 a.m., 3 knocks. Slow, deliberate. The sound reverberated through the studio, through his bones, through time itself. The condensation on the window had formed complete sentences now. He tried not to read them, but the words forced themselves into his consciousness. You have already agreed. In 47 years, you agreed. The broadcast must continue. The frequency must be maintained. Open the door and accept what you have already accepted. His hand was on the doorknob. The metal was ice cold and burning simultaneously. Through the small window, the darkness shifted, anticipating. The record player clicked, the needle moving to the next track on its own. His older voice returned, resigned. You're going to open it. You have to, because I already did. Because in 47 years, you'll record this message knowing it won't change anything. The station needs a keeper. The frequency needs a voice. And something needs to be let in, over and over, night after night, until time itself forgets which came first, the broadcast or the echo. He turned the knob. The door opened inward, revealing the hallway. It was empty, but the darkness moved, flowed into the studio like smoke with purpose. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in an instant. His breath fogged the air, mingled with something else breathing. Something that shouldn't be. The lights flickered once, twice, then steadied. When he turned back to the console, someone was sitting in his chair. Himself, older, grayer, wearing the same flannel shirt, but weathered by decades. He himself looked up with eyes that had seen this moment from both sides. "Your shift is over," he said with his voice, aged like whiskey left too long in the barrel. "My shift is beginning again." He wanted to speak, to demand answers, but his throat closed. The older him continued. "In 47 years, you'll sit in this chair and say these words to yourself. You'll try to change them, add warnings, provide escape routes, but the script is already written. The broadcast is already scheduled." The condensation on the window evaporated instantly, leaving no trace. The parking lot outside was no longer empty. Cars from different decades filled the spaces: a 76 Chevelle, an 89 Ford pickup, a 2003 Honda Civic, all covered in dust, their windows dark. "Those are ours," the older him explained. "Every version that's walked through that door. We keep coming back, thinking this time will be different, but the frequency needs us, needs our voice, needs the echo to justify the original." The record player spun to silence. The on-air sign flickered off. "Go home," the older him said. "Come back tomorrow night, and the next. In 47 years, you'll understand. Or maybe you already do." He backed toward the door, his feet moving without conscious thought. In the hallway, the darkness had weight presence. It followed him to the exit, ensured he left, ensured he'd return. Outside, his car was already running, exhaust visible in the cold desert air. He didn't remember starting it. As he drove away, the radio turned on by itself, tuned to KXNM. His voice, but not his voice. Not yet read the weather. Clear skies tonight, with morning fog expected. Visibility will be limited, especially around the old AM tower off Route 47. Drivers are advised to use caution. Time now is 2:33 a.m., and here's a classic from 1976. The blues began to play, Shadows on the Mesa. He'd never heard it before. He'd heard it every night for 47 years. As he drove home through the empty desert roads, one truth settled into his bones like winter. He'd be back tomorrow night. Not because he wanted to, but because he already had been. The echo came before the voice. The answer preceded the question. And somewhere in the static between AM frequencies, 47 years from now, he was recording a warning that he'd already ignored. The cycle continued. The broadcast never ended. It just echoed out the warehouse circuit, where objects in memory disappear. What if the place you work at night isn't just a building, but a living system, one that learns your habits, rearranges your reality, and slowly, methodically, makes you part of its impossible network? Imagine a warehouse complex so vast and empty that your footsteps echo for minutes, and the only things that move are the things you're sure you left somewhere else. Now imagine that the more you try to map its logic, the more it changes you, until you can't tell where the building ends and you begin. This is the story of a night security guard in Toledo, Ohio, and the Fortiker warehouse complex that turned his life into a maze of vanishing objects, impossible cold spots, and a circuit that seems to run not just through concrete and steel, but through time, memory, and the very fabric of reality. It started with the cold. Box 7, one of the dozens of identical warehouses in the complex, always ran 2 degrees colder than the others, no matter the season, no matter how many times he checked the breakers or the insulation. The temperature in Box 7 never matched the rest. At first he chalked it up to drafts, poor construction, maybe a quirk of the building's position on the lot. But the cold was just the beginning. The disappearances came next. At first, it was small things, screws missing from his toolbox during the 2 a.m. rounds, only to turn up hours later, arranged in perfect spirals on the loading dock of Box 14, 300 meters away. The concrete floors had a peculiar quality. They seemed to absorb small objects, pulling them down through hairline cracks that shouldn't exist in solid cement. Hours later, sometimes days, These items would resurface elsewhere in the complex. Following patterns, he tried to map in a notebook that itself went missing one Tuesday night. He'd been walking these rows for 3 years, and he'd learned to accept certain things. The cold was one of them. The disappearances were another, but the patterns, the way objects moved, the way the buildings seemed to communicate, those were what kept him up during the day. Long after his shift ended, the security office sat at the heart of the complex. A glorified shipping container converted into a monitoring station. 16 screens showed feeds from cameras that captured nothing but empty corridors and loading bays. He'd watched the recordings frame by frame, trying to understand how objects moved between locations without ever appearing on camera. The footage would show him placing his coffee mug on the desk at jam 11:47 p.m. At 11:48, the mug was gone. At 2:15 a.m., camera 12 would show it sitting on a forklift seat in box 9, still steaming. His supervisor thought he was losing things, getting confused in the repetitive maze of identical structures. But he knew better. The complex had its own circulation system, an invisible network that redistributed objects according to rules he couldn't comprehend. Each building connected to this circuit at specific points, usually corners where the foundation met the earth, or spots where the overhead lights flickered without electrical cause. 3 weeks ago, his keys vanished from his pocket while he was checking the perimeter fence. He found them 4 hours later, hanging from a pipe valve 20 feet off the ground in box 11. They were wet, dripping with water that smelled like copper and old electricity. There was no water source in box 11. There hadn't been plumbing there since the previous tenants. A medical supply company moved out in 2019. The pattern intensified last month. Instead of simple displacement, objects began returning altered. His pen reappeared with ink that wrote in reverse. A work glove came back inside out, with the stitching on the wrong side. His thermos returned, filled with a liquid that looked like coffee, but tasted like iron filings and static electricity. He started carrying backup items, spare flashlights, extra batteries, duplicate keys. The complex seemed to prefer originals, leaving copies mostly untouched. This suggested intelligence, or at least preference, though he tried not to think too hard about what that implied. Tonight, something felt different. The air pressure in box 7 dropped whenever he approached, making his ears pop like he was descending in an airplane. The concrete floor had developed new patterns, hairline fractures that formed geometric shapes, almost like circuit boards etched into the foundation. When he shined his light at certain angles, they seemed to pulse with a faint luminescence that disappeared when he looked directly at it. His radio crackled with static that sounded almost like language, not English. Not any language he recognized, but structured nonetheless. Patterns within patterns. He'd been recording these transmissions on his phone, though the files always corrupted when he tried to transfer them. The phone itself disappeared for 6 hours last week, returning with a full battery, despite being dead when it vanished. The photos in his gallery had been reorganized, sorted not by date, but by some other system he couldn't identify. Pictures of empty warehouses were grouped with images of his apartment. Screenshots of weather reports were filed with photos of his hands. He checked box 7 first. As always, the temperature differential hit him like walking into a freezer, though his breath barely showed. The concrete here felt different under his boots, softer somehow, like it wasn't quite solid. Objects left here overnight sank slightly into the floor, leaving impressions that lasted for days. He'd measured some of these depressions, perfect circles, exactly 7.3 inches in diameter, regardless of the object's actual size. His flashlight flickered, though he'd replaced the batteries an hour ago. In the stuttering light, he caught movement in his peripheral vision, not quite shadows, but distortions in the air itself, like heat mirages in reverse. They followed the geometric patterns in the floor, flowing through the fractures like current through wires. The radio on his belt disappeared mid. He felt it there one moment, gone the next, the weight simply ceasing to exist. No sound, no sensation of it being pulled away, just absence where presence was. This was how it happened, between heartbeats, between thoughts. In the spaces where attention briefly lapsed, he knew where it would appear. The complex had been teaching him its logic through repetition and loss. Box 12, on the roof, still transmitting, but tuned to a frequency that didn't exist on the dial. He'd find it there in exactly 93 minutes, covered in condensation that shouldn't form in this weather, playing static that sounded like breathing. The walk to Box 12 took him through the heart of the complex, past loading docks where puddles formed without rain, and doorways that felt colder on the inside than the outside. The other guards who worked days told him nothing unusual happened during their shifts. The disappearances, the displacements, the alterations, they were reserved for the night, for the hours when the complex operated according to its other purpose. He'd been researching the land's history. Before the warehouses, this was farmland. Before that, wetlands that the indigenous peoples avoided, claiming the ground here was hollow. Geological surveys from the 1960s noted unusual mineral deposits, crystalline structures that shouldn't form in this region's sediment. The reports were filed away, deemed irrelevant to commercial development. Box 9 hummed with a subsonic vibration that he felt in his bones. Inside, forklifts were parked in rows, their keys removed and locked in the office. Yet sometimes he found them in different positions come morning, their batteries drained despite being fully charged at shift's end. The floor here had more of those circuit-like patterns, converging on a spot near the eastern wall, where the temperature dropped another 5 degrees. He placed his hand on that wall, and for a moment, he felt something like a pulse knot, quite electrical, not quite organic, but undeniably present. His palm came away damp, though the wall appeared dry. The moisture smelled like ozone and copper, like the air before lightning strikes, like the taste of batteries on the tongue. His badge disappeared from his belt. Unlike the radio, he felt this one go a sensation like it was being pulled through the clip, through the fabric, through space itself. It would return in 4 hours. He knew this now. It would be in his jacket pocket, soaking wet, smelling of that same copper electric scent when he scanned it tomorrow morning. The system would show he'd been in areas of the complex that didn't exist on any blueprint. The circuit was learning him the way he was learning it. Each disappeared object was a probe, testing the boundaries of what he'd accept, what he'd rationalize, what he'd report. He stopped filing incident reports after the 3rd week. His supervisor's concerned looks were worse than the phenomena themselves. Box 12 loomed ahead, its roof accessible via a rusted ladder that sang in the wind. He climbed, knowing what he'd find, but needing to confirm the pattern held. The radio sat exactly where expected, in the center of the roof, crackling with that not-quite language static. It was wet, though the night was dry. The moisture pooled around it in a perfect circle, 7.3 inches in diameter. He picked it up, and for a moment, through the static, he heard something that might be his own voice, displaced in time, saying words he hadn't spoken yet. Door, maybe words he'd already forgotten speaking. The complex made it hard to distinguish between memory and premonition, between what had happened and what was happening. The city lights of Toledo spread out beyond the fence, normal and distant. People were sleeping in houses where objects stayed where they were placed, where floors remained solid, where the only circuits were the ones carrying electricity through copper wires. They didn't know about places like this, where the infrastructure had developed its own agenda, its own metabolism. His notebook reappeared in box 3, filled with his handwriting, but containing entries he didn't remember making. They described patterns he hadn't noticed yet, documented disappearances that hadn't happened yet, or maybe they had happened and he'd forgotten. The complex did things to memory, made it unreliable, made him question the sequence of events. One entry dated 3 days from now described finding his own body's impression in the concrete of box 7, as if he'd been lying there long enough to sink into the floor. Another entry, dated last month, mentioned a room that didn't exist, box 0, located beneath the complex, accessible through the floor patterns when they aligned correctly. He started leaving himself notes, not trusting his memory to remain stable within the complex's influence. Post-its on the security office walls, reminders on his phone, messages written on his arms in permanent marker. They helped, mostly, though sometimes he found notes he didn't remember writing, in handwriting that was his but different. Like he was corresponding with alternate versions of himself across the circuit. The temperature in box 7 continued to drop. He'd measured it at -2 degrees Celsius, now impossible for a structure with no cooling system. Frost formed on the inside walls in patterns that mirrored the fractures in the floor. When he traced these patterns with his flashlight, they seemed to extend beyond the walls, suggesting a structure larger than the warehouse itself, existing in spaces that overlapped but didn't quite coincide with normal architecture. His watch stopped at 3:33 a.m. It would start again in exactly 7 minutes, showing the correct time as if it had never stopped. This happened every night, now a regularity within the irregularity. During those 7 minutes, the complex felt different, more active, more present, like it was fully awake and aware. He found his badge in his jacket pocket, soaking wet, as predicted. The water was body temperature, exactly 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, and it never seemed to dry completely. He started carrying plastic bags to protect his other belongings from the moisture that accompanied returned items. The circuit map he'd been trying to construct showed connections that shouldn't exist. Direct links between buildings separated by hundreds of meters, pathways that passed through solid earth, convergence points that occupied the same space simultaneously. It wasn't a map of physical infrastructure, but something else, something that used the warehouses as anchor points for a network that extended in directions we don't have words for. Last night, he found a tooth in box 14. Not human, too long, too curved, with roots that branched like tree roots. It was warm to the touch, and when he picked it up, he felt the circuits pulse through it, stronger and clearer than ever. He left it where he found it, but it followed him home, appearing in his bathroom sink, still warm, still pulsing with that not-quite life. The other guards started avoiding him. They said he smelled like copper and static, that his presence made their radios malfunction. They weren't wrong. The circuit had marked him somehow, made him part of its redistribution network. Small objects disappeared around him, even outside the complex now pens coins, keys. They returned hours later, always wet, always in impossible locations. His apartment developed cold spots, areas where the temperature dropped without explanation. He found those same geometric patterns starting to form in the paint on his walls, faint but growing clearer each day. The complex was spreading, using him as a conduit to extend its reach beyond the 40 acres of industrial property. He should quit. He should walk away, find another job, move to another city, but he couldn't. The circuit wouldn't let him, or he wouldn't let himself. He couldn't tell the difference anymore. Each night he returned to walk the rows, to document the disappearances, to feel the pulse through the walls and floors. He was part of the pattern now. Another object being moved through the network, according to rules he'd never fully understand. Tonight, his flashlight revealed something new in box 7. The geometric patterns in the floor had aligned, forming a perfect spiral that descended through the concrete like a drain. But it wasn't draining anything. It was feeding something up, something that made the air shimmer and distort, something that smelled like copper and electricity and time, itself dissolving. He leaned closer and saw himself reflected in the spiral, not just one reflection, but dozens, each slightly different, each from a slightly different angle of time. In some, he was younger, in others, older. In one, he wasn't there at all, just an empty uniform standing on its own. The radio crackled with that familiar static, and this time he understood it wasn't language, but location coordinates in the circuit's navigation system, marking points where reality wore thin enough for objects to slip through. The complex wasn't just redistributing things, it was sampling them, learning their properties, incorporating them into something larger. His badge began to glow with a soft phosphorescence, the same light he'd been seeing in the floor patterns. When he held it up, he could see through its sea, the circuit's true structure, overlaid on the physical world. A vast network of flowing energy that treated matter like data, moving it through channels that existed between spaces, storing it in locations that occupied no location. He understood now why objects returned wet. They weren't being submerged in water, but in something else, something that existed in the spaces between molecules, something that conducted the circuit's intentions through the physical world. The moisture was a residue of translation, evidence of passage through states we haven't discovered yet. The tooth appeared in his hand without him reaching for it. It was no longer warm, but burning, almost too hot to hold. Through it, he felt the entire complex's awareness focus on him, recognizing him as either an intruder or an invitation. He couldn't tell which. The circuit didn't distinguish between observer and observed, between guard and guarded. His radio disappeared again, but this time he disappeared with it. For a moment that lasted no time at all, he existed in the circuit's native state, dispersed across the network, experiencing every location simultaneously. He saw the entire history of the complex, layers of time stacked like transparent sheets. He saw other guards who'd worked here, some from decades ago, still walking their rounds in parallel timelines that occasionally intersected with his dot. Then he was back, standing on the roof of Box 12, radio in hand, soaking wet despite the clear night. His clothes smelled like copper and ozone. His watch showed 3:40 a.m., but his phone showed 5:15 a.m. Both were correct, depending on which timeline he was choosing to observe. The notebook in his pocket had new entries written in his handwriting, describing events he didn't remember, but knew were true. They spoke of Box 0, of the room beneath the complex, where the circuit's core processed reality into something more fluid, more negotiable. They described how to find it, how to access it through the aligned patterns in Box 7's floor. But they also warned against it. The entries written by versions of him that had already been there described changes that couldn't be undone, perception permanently altered. Existence spread across multiple states simultaneously. Consciousness distributed through the circuit like data through a network. He walked back to the security office, his footsteps echoing in ways that suggested more than one person walking. The screens showed him in multiple locations at once, centering Box 3, leaving Box 9, standing still in Box 7. All of it was happening. All of it had happened. All of it would happen. The sun rose over Toledo, painting the warehouses in normal light that made the night's experiences feel like dreams or delusions. The day shift arrived, and they saw nothing unusual, just him looking tired, smelling faintly of copper, clutching a notebook filled with incomprehensible diagrams. He clocked out and drove home, through streets that seemed too solid, too permanent. In his apartment, he found his missing items arranged in a perfect spiral on his living room floor. Every pen, every key, every small object that had disappeared over the past 3 months. They were all dry now, no longer pulsing with that strange energy. Just ordinary things that had taken an extraordinary journey, but he knew tonight he'd return. The circuit called to him through the patterns forming in his walls, through the cold spots spreading across his floor, through the taste of copper that never quite left his tongue. He was part of it now, or it was part of him, or they were part of something else that neither of them fully comprehended. The complex waited, patient and hungry, processing reality through its concrete circuits, teaching him through displacement and return that nothing was as permanent as we believe, that everything is just data, waiting to be redistributed through channels we're only beginning to perceive. His badge glowed softly in the darkness of his pocket, a beacon marking him as translated, as someone who'd passed through the circuit and returned changed, not damaged, not improved, just different, aware of the spaces between spaces, the times between times, the vast network that used our physical world as just one layer of its impossible infrastructure. Tomorrow night, he'd check box 7 first. As always, the temperature would be colder, the patterns would be clearer, and maybe, if the alignment was right, he'd find the entrance to box 0, where the circuit's true purpose waited to be discovered, door to discover him. The tooth sat on his nightstand, no longer burning, but warm, always warm, like something alive, but not quite living. Through it, he could feel the complex breathing 40 acres of concrete and steel, inhaling and exhaling in rhythms that predated the warehouses, predated the city, predated everything except the hollow ground itself. He closed his eyes, but he could still see the circuit's light behind his eyelids, geometric patterns flowing like blood through veins, like thoughts through neurons, like objects through space that isn't quite space. The disappearances weren't theft or malfunction, they were communication, the complex learning to speak through displacement, teaching him to understand through loss and return. His radio crackled from somewhere he couldn't locate, playing that static that sounded like language from a future where words worked differently. He listened and almost understood what it was trying to tell him about what the complex really was, what it was becoming, what they were becoming together. But understanding, like everything else here, was subject to redistribution by morning. He'd have forgotten half of what he'd learned, only to remember it again tomorrow night, when he walked the rows and felt the pulse through the walls. The circuit kept some knowledge in circulation, moving it through minds like it moved objects through space, ensuring nothing stayed in one place long enough to become certain. This was his life now, walking between states, guarding warehouses that guarded something else, something that used the industrial architecture as camouflage for processes we haven't invented words for yet. Each night brought new patterns, new disappearances, new returns. Each night, he sank a little deeper into the circuit's logic, trading human certainty for something more fluid, more interconnected, more aware of the spaces between what we call real. The complex spread one returned object at a time, one wet badge at a time, one transformed guard at a time. They were all part of the circuit now, whether they knew it or not. Their possessions and perceptions subject to redistribution, according to patterns that emerged from the hollow ground, from the crystalline structures that shouldn't exist, from the temperature differentials that made no sense, and somewhere in box 0, or beyond it, something watched through the circuit, learning them the way they were learning it, preparing for a convergence that his future notebook entries only hinted at, a moment when the invisible network became visible, when the displacement became placement, when they finally understood what they'd been guarding all along. But that understanding, like everything else, would come at a cost, measured in disappeared moments and returned memories, in wet badges and warm teeth, in the steady transformation of guards into something else, conductors, in a circuit that ran through reality itself, keeping things in motion, preventing stasis, ensuring that nothing, not even comprehension, ever stayed where they put it. The sun set. His shift began again. Box 7 waited, 2 degrees colder than yesterday, its patterns almost complete. Tonight, maybe he'd find what he'd been looking for. It would find him. In the circuit, there was no difference. The complex breathed. He breathed with it. Together, they redistribute a reality, one small object at a time. The silver car in the garage, where the ramp never ends. What if the most haunted place in your city isn't a crumbling mansion or a forgotten hospital, but a parking garage? Not the kind of place you'd expect to find ghosts, just concrete, steel, and the echo of your own footsteps. But what if, in the dead hours before dawn, the garage becomes a gateway, and the car you see every night isn't just another commuter, but something waiting for you to notice it? What if the real danger isn't what's parked next to you, but what's waiting on the other side of the wall? This is the story of a rideshare driver in Denver, and a silver car that turned his nightly routine into a descent through impossible levels, puddles that defied gravity, and a haunting that followed him home, one that made him question whether he was ever really alone in the garage, or if he was just another driver waiting for his turn to disappear. It started, as these stories often do, with a routine. He'd been driving nights for a few weeks, learning the rhythms of the city after midnight. The airport runs were good money, and he'd found a perfect spot to wait between rides, a 5-story parking garage, abandoned by whatever office building it once served. The security cameras were dark, their recording lights long extinguished. Level 3 became his spot, close enough to street level for quick exits, high enough for decent cell signal. He'd park near pillar C3, lean back, and watch the city lights blur through rain-streaked glass. The first time he saw the silver car, he barely noticed it. Just another vehicle sliding into the garage at 2:47 a.m., headlights sweeping across concrete pillars before dying abruptly. He watched it pass his level, heading toward 4 or 5, then silence. His phone buzz, airport run. He forgot about the silver car, but it came back the next night, and the next. Always between 2:45 and 3 a.m., always that confident ascent, always those headlights dying after passing level 3. He started watching for it, tracking its arrival between rides. The car looked like a newer sedan, maybe European, though he could never make out the model in darkness. Windows tinted black, impossible to see through. After a week of this routine, curiosity got the better of him. One night, after the silver car made its climb, he walked up to level 4. The garage felt different there, colder somehow, though that made no sense. The air tasted stale, metallic. Level 4 was empty. He checked level 5, also empty. The exit cameras on each level were positioned to catch every vehicle leaving. He'd checked them all when he first started using the garage, making sure they were truly dead. The silver car had to be up here somewhere, but at WASN single quotes, he went back to his car, unsettled, but trying to rationalize it. Maybe there was a hidden spot he'd missed. Maybe the driver had some arrangement with building management. Not his business. But then he found the puddles. They appeared overnight near pillar C3, right where he usually parked. Perfect circles of water, maybe 3 feet across, with no source. The ceiling above was bone dry. He checked with his phone's flashlight, running his hand along the concrete. No pipes, no cracks, no moisture at all. But every morning when he arrived for his shift, there they were, fresh puddles that hadn't been there 6 hours earlier. The water had an odd quality. It didn't reflect light properly. The beam seemed to sink into the surface rather than bounce back, and it was warm, not hot, but noticeably warmer than it should have been in a freezing garage. He started parking one space over. The puddles began spreading, not all at once, but gradually, night by night. They'd creep across the painted parking lines, following a path that made no sense. The water would flow uphill sometimes, defying gravity, to climb the slight incline toward the ramp. Then came the tire tracks. He discovered them by accident, arriving earlier than usual one night when a ride canceled last minute. The puddles were still wet, still spreading, and through them ran fresh tire tracks. They led from the puddle directly up the ramp, water darkening the concrete in 2 parallel lines. He followed them. The tracks climbed the ramp in perfect alignment, never wavering, never showing any sign of the slight corrections a human driver would make. They continued up past level 4, past level 5, and then they went straight into the wall. Not up to the wall, into it. The tracks just continued, as if the wall wasn't there, the wet marks disappearing into solid concrete. He pressed his hand against the spot where they vanished. The wall was vibrating, subtle, but unmistakable, like there was an engine idling on the other side. The concrete felt warm, almost feverish. He yanked his hand back and stumbled away. That night, he started getting complaints. 3 passengers mentioned it, unprompted. A smell in his car like exhaust fumes, but sweeter, chemical. One woman asked if he'd had work done recently. A businessman kept rolling down the window, claiming dizziness. He couldn't smell anything, but after dropping off that businessman, he noticed his hands were shaking. Not from cold or exhaustion. They were trembling in rhythm with something he couldn't quite identify. He checked his car's exhaust system the next day. Nothing wrong. Had the oil changed, the filters replaced, the smell persisted. Only at night, only after he'd been in the garage. The smart thing would have been to find a new waiting spot, but he needed to understand what was happening. The silver car, the puddles, the tracks that led through solid wall, they were connected somehow. They had to be done. So he started recording. He positioned his phone on the dashboard, aimed at pillar C3. Set to record from 2:30 to 3:30 a.m. The first few nights showed nothing, just the empty garage. But on the 4th night, something changed. At 2:58 a.m., the puddles began to form, not slowly seeping from somewhere, but materializing. The concrete darkened in perfect circles, water appearing from nowhere. Then at 3 a.m. exactly, the silver car appeared in the frame. It hadn't driven up the ramp. It was simply there, parked 2 spaces over from his usual spot, engine running. The exhaust pipe was releasing something, but it wasn't normal exhaust. It was liquid, thick and dark, pooling beneath the car before spreading across the concrete. He was watching this video while parked in that same spot. He looked up from his phone to where the silver car should have been. The space was empty. He looked back at the phone. The car was there on the screen, clear as day, that dark liquid still pouring from its exhaust. He held up the phone, using it like a window. Through the screen, the silver car sat there, impossibly present, without the phone empty space. His hands were shaking worse now, that rhythmic trembling matching the vibration he'd felt in the wall. The car on the screen began to move. It pulled forward slowly, those same deliberate movements he'd observed before. It drove toward the ramp, and he followed, keeping it centered in his phone screen. Up past level 4, past level 5, and then it drove through the walnut into through. On his screen, there was no wall. The ramp continued, spiraling upward into levels that didn't exist. 6, 7, 8 floors that weren't there when he looked with his own eyes. The silver car climbed steadily, its red tail lights growing smaller, but never quite disappearing. He lowered the phone, and there was only the wall. Raised it, and the impossible ramp stretched upward into darkness. A text notification popped up: airport run. His hands moved automatically, accepting the ride, but his mind was fragmenting, trying to process what he was seeing. He drove to the pickup in a daze, the phone hot in his pocket like it had absorbed something from that footage. The passenger was a woman heading to catch a red-eye flight. She settled into the back seat, then immediately started coughing. God, what is that smell? She gasped between coughs. It's like burning plastic and antifreeze. He couldn't smell it, but in the rearview mirror, he saw something that made his blood freeze. There was condensation on the inside of her window, and in that condensation, someone had drawn something. No, something was drawing itself. Lines appearing in the moisture, forming shapes. Tire tracks. They materialized slowly, 2 parallel lines running horizontally across the glass. Then, as he watched, they began to climb, defying logic. Running up the window toward the roof of the car, the woman saw them too. She pressed herself against the opposite door, her breath coming in sharp gasps. The tracks continued forming, spreading across the rear windshield now, always climbing, always moving upward as if following an invisible ramp. He pulled over, told her there was an engine problem, called her another ride. She practically ran for his car. He sat there on the shoulder of I-7, watching those impossible tracks fade as the condensation evaporated. But he went back the next night. He had to. The garage felt occupied now, full. Like every empty space was actually filled with something he couldn't quite perceive. The air was thicker, harder to breathe. His footsteps echoed wrong, distorted, multiplied. At 2:55 a.m. He positioned himself at pillar C3 with his phone ready. The puddles formed on schedule. The silver car appeared on the screen. But this time, he saw something else. Other cars, dozens of them, all silver, all identical to the first. They filled every space on every level, engines idling in perfect synchronization. The vibration he'd felt in the wall was their collective idol. Hundreds of engines running behind concrete that was somehow both there and not there. And in each car, visible through windows that were clear on his phone screen, sat drivers. They all had the same posture, hands at 10 and 2, back straight, heads facing forward. None of them moved. None of them blinked. They just sat there, waiting, while that dark liquid poured from every exhaust pipe, pooling and spreading across floors that existed in parallel to the ones he could see. He realized then that the smell his passengers complained about wasn't coming from his car. It was coming from him. He'd been breathing it in night after night, absorbing whatever those silver cars were releasing. It was inside him now, seeping from his pores, coating his lungs. He backed away from pillar C3, but on his phone screen, he didn't move. The version of him on the screen stood perfectly still, hands at his sides, head tilted slightly, as if listening to something. As he watched, that other him walk toward the nearest silver car. The door opened for him. He got in, adjusted the mirror, placed his hands at 10 and 2. He ran, dropped his phone, left it there recording, and ran down the ramps to his car. But when he reached it, there was condensation on all the windows. The tracks were everywhere now in the glass, on the hood, on the concrete around his vehicle. They all led upward, all pointing toward those invisible levels above. His car wouldn't start. The engine turned over, but wouldn't catch. The smell was overwhelming now, even to him. Exhaust and antifreeze and something else, something organic and wrong. He kept turning the key, pumping the gas, begging it to start. Then he heard it. Engines, hundreds of them, revving in unison somewhere above him. The whole garage shook with the sound, concrete dust drifting from the ceiling like snow. The puddles around his car began to bubble and spread, warm water flowing upward against gravity, following those impossible tracks. His car finally started. He threw it in reverse, tires squealing against wet concrete. In the rearview mirror, he saw them silver cars descending the ramp in a perfect line, their headlights dark, but somehow still visible, like shadows in reverse. He made it out, burst through the garage exit onto the empty street, running a red light, not stopping until he was miles away. He pulled into a gas station, hands shaking. The attendant knocked on his window, looking concerned. When he rolled it down, the man stepped back. "You okay, buddy? Your car is smoking bad." He looked back. Dark liquid was dripping from his exhaust pipe, pooling on the asphalt. The same liquid from the silver cars. It spread slowly, defying the slope of the parking lot, creeping upward toward the gas pumps. He abandoned his car there, walked home in the freezing pre-dawn darkness, calling in sick to every ride he had scheduled. But when he got to his apartment, when he finally felt safe enough to check his jacket pocket, he found his phone, the one he'd dropped in the garage. It was still recording. The screen showed him sitting in his living room, watching himself on the phone. Behind him, visible through his apartment window on the screen, but not in reality, was the parking garage. It towered impossibly high, dozens of floors that didn't exist stretching up into a dark sky. Every level was packed with silver cars, all of them facing outward, waiting. He stopped driving nights, stopped driving altogether. But every morning at 3 a.m., he woke to the sound of engines idling outside his window. Exhaust seeped through the walls. Puddles formed on his bathroom floor, perfect circles of warm water that trailed up the walls when he wasn't looking. Sometimes he checked his phone, holding it up like a window to that other space. He saw himself in the silver car now, hands at 10 and 2, engine running. That version of him never moved, never blinked, just sat there producing that dark liquid that spread across dimensions he couldn't perceive without the screen. The other drivers, the ones who complained about the smell, started texting him, all of them, even though he never gave them his number. The messages were always the same. Level 6, Space 43, engine running. He knew what it meant. There was a spot waiting for him since that first night he saw the silver car. All he had to do was go back to the garage, take the ramp up past the wall, and park where he was supposed to be, where some part of him already was. The puddles in his bathroom were getting bigger. The tracks on his windows were permanent now, etched into the glass. And every night those engines got louder, closer. He thought about that wall in the garage, how it vibrated with engines running behind it. He pressed his hand against his apartment wall sometimes and felt the same thing, that rhythmic idle of machines waiting for their drivers to return. The silver car wasn't entering the garage. It was exiting from somewhere else, somewhere that overlapped with our world, but wasn't quite part of it. And every night he spent there, breathing in those fumes, sitting in those puddles. He was being prepared, converted, made compatible with wherever those cars really came from. He stopped looking at his phone, but he couldn't throw it away. Sometimes it rang, his own number calling itself. He never answered, but the voicemail was always the same, just the sound of an engine idling, perfect and patient. The water climbed his walls at night, leaving tracks that spelled out numbers, coordinates maybe, or countdowns. He knew he'd go back eventually, not because he wanted to, but because part of him was already there, sitting in that silver car on level 6, Space 43, engine running, producing the dark liquid that seeped between dimensions. The garage wasn't abandoned. It never was. It was fuller than should be possible. Every space occupied by drivers who found it just like he did, who breathed in the fumes and saw the tracks that led through solid walls. They were all there, idling forever in spaces parallel to reality, visible only through screens that showed too much. He could hear them now, even without the phone. Hundreds of engines in perfect synchronization, their exhaust creating puddles that appeared in empty garages across the city, spreading one driver at a time, one breath of tainted air at a time. His hands had stopped shaking and started vibrating, matching that universal idol. When he looked in the mirror, his reflection sometimes had its hands at 10 and 2, even when his were at his sides. Level 6, Space 43, engine running. The coordinates pulsed behind his eyes. The taste of exhaust coated his throat. The puddles in his apartment formed tire tracks that led to his door, then through it, as if the door wasn't there at all. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe nothing is as solid as we think. The backward walker in Acadia, when your own footsteps betray you. What if the thing following you in the snow isn't a stranger, but a version of yourself you can't see? What if the footprints you find behind you are your own, but changed, edited, rearranged, leading you somewhere you never meant to go? In the frozen silence of Acadia National Park, one photographer learned that the most terrifying hauntings aren't always about ghosts. Sometimes, the land itself can rewrite your path, and the reflection you see in the ice might not be you at all. This is the story of a winter in Maine, a set of impossible footprints and a handprint in the snow that should never have existed. It's a story about being followed by something that knows you better than you. Know yourself, and about the moment you realize you might never have left the woods at all. It started, as these stories often do, with a routine. The photographer had been coming to Acadia for 3 winters. drawn by the way the park transformed under snow and ice. He preferred the off-season, when the crowds were gone, and the only sounds were the wind in the pines and the distant crack of ice shifting on the lakes. He'd built a portfolio of frozen waterfalls, frost-etched birches, and the way morning light turned Eagle Lake into molten silver. He knew the trails, the shortcuts, the best places to catch the sunrise. He thought he knew the land. But this winter felt different from the moment he arrived. The usual ranger at the visitor center had been replaced by someone who barely looked up when he signed in. The few other winter hikers he encountered moved past without the typical nods of acknowledgement. Even the park itself seemed altered. Familiar trails, branching in directions he didn't remember, distances feeling stretched or compressed, as if the land was subtly rearranging itself when he wasn't looking. The first time he noticed the second set of boot prints, he convinced himself they belonged to another early morning photographer. Acadia in winter draws a particular breed of solitary souls who find beauty in the way. Ice transforms familiar trails into alien landscapes. It made sense that someone else would be out at dawn, following the same path along Jordan Pond's frozen shoreline. But the prince maintained a perfect distance, always 40, maybe 50 feet behind. When he stopped to adjust his camera settings or frame a shot of the bubbles reflected in patches of unfrozen water, the footsteps stopped, too. When he moved on, they resumed. The precision of it gnawed at him, not the casual wandering of another hiker, but something deliberate, measured. On the fourth day of being followed, he tried an experiment. Instead of his planned route up Cadillac Mountain's South Ridge, he took a sharp left onto the Gorham Mountain Trail, moving fast through knee-deep snow. The boot prints followed. He doubled back suddenly, expecting to catch a glimpse of his pursuer, but the trail behind him was empty. Just 2 sets of prints in the snow, his heading out, and the others maintaining that same careful distance. That night, in his rented cabin near Bar Harbor, he studied his photographs from the day. In several shots, he could see the second set of prints in the background, always at the edge of the frame. But something was wrong with them. In one image taken near Thunderhole, the prints seemed to skip 3 feet, then suddenly 10, as if the walker had taken an impossible stride. In another, near the precipice trail, they appeared to split briefly to left boots side by side, before merging back into a single track. He zoomed in until the pixels broke apart, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The boot pattern was familiar, a distinctive waffle sole with a diagonal cut across the heel. He looked down at his own boots, drying by the door. The same pattern. Sleep came fitfully that night. He dreamed of walking endless loops through virgin snow, following his own footprints in circles that grew tighter with each revolution, until he was spinning in place, the world blurring around him. He woke to find his boots moved, still by the door, but facing inward now, toes pointing at him like an accusation. The next morning brought fresh snow, inches that should have erased all traces of previous travels. But when he reached the trailhead for the Beehive Loop, he found them again, his prints from yesterday, somehow preserved beneath the new snowfall, visible as depressions, and beside them, following them, the second set. He abandoned photography that day, focusing instead on the puzzle of his pursuer. He varied his pace, stopped randomly, backtracked, took unmarked paths through the woods. The prince followed every move, anticipated every turn. When he tried to set up an ambush near Bubble Pond, waiting behind a cluster of boulders with his camera ready, he found the following prints had somehow circled around, approaching from a different direction he hadn't taken. By the 7th day, the prints had begun to change. They no longer simply followed. They intersected with his at impossible angles. He'd find places where the 2 sets crossed in X patterns, though he knew he'd walked straight through. Other spots showed the following prints, walking backward alongside his heel to toe with his forward progress. In one disturbing section near Sand Beach, He found his own prints from that morning, altered extra steps added between his strides, forming geometric patterns in the snow. The temperature dropped that afternoon, the kind of sudden plunge that turns breath into ice crystals before it leaves your mouth. He was photographing the frozen spray sculptures near Otter Cliff when he noticed the prints had formed something new arrows. His morning tracks had been edited, supplemented with additional steps that created clear directional markers pointing inland, away from the coast, toward the dense interior of the park where cell coverage disappeared. He followed them. What else could he do? Each arrow led to the next, a breadcrumb trail made of his own footsteps, rearranged by someone or something that understood his gait perfectly. The path led him off trail, through stands of pine so thick the canopy blocked the already dim winter light. His GPS showed him moving through areas that should have been impassable, elevation lines that didn't match the terrain he was crossing. The arrows led him in a wide arc that seemed designed to avoid the main trails, to keep him away from any chance encounters with other hikers. As the light began to fade, painting the snow purple-gray, he realized he was being herded, but toward what? He found it just as the last daylight dyed a perfectly circular clearing, maybe 30 feet across. The snow here was pristine, untouched, so smooth it looked like a frozen pond. His footprints stopped at the edge, and so did the ones that had been following him. They all stopped, as if both sets of tracks had been walking toward this place from opposite directions, meeting here at this threshold, in the center of the clearing. The snow was disturbed in only one spot, a clear handprint, palm facing upward, fingers spread. But the print was wrong. It wasn't pressed down into the snow, but seemed to rise from beneath, as if someone buried below had reached up, their hand melting through the surface, just enough to leave a wet impression before withdrawing. He approached slowly, his boots breaking the perfect surface. The handprint was human in shape, but too large, the fingers too long, the palm too wide. Water pooled in its depressions despite the below freezing temperature, never quite turning to ice. He knelt beside it, pulled off his glove, and held his hand above it, comparing size. The water in the palm print began to move, swirling in patterns that reminded him of fingerprints in negative space. He found himself leaning closer, his hand descending toward it without conscious thought. The water was warm. He could feel heat rising from it, steam that didn't quite form, a humid breath in the frozen air. His fingers were inches from touching the water when he saw the reflection in it. Not his face looking down, but his face looking up, as if he were beneath the snow, drowning in white, reaching desperately toward the surface. The reflected him was screaming silently, eyes wide with a terror he didn't feel. He jerked back, stumbled, fell. When he looked again, the handprint was gone. The snow where it had been was smooth, untouched, as if he had imagined it. But his knees had left deep impressions where he'd knelt, and in those impressions, water was beginning to pool. He ran, crashed through the woods in growing darkness, branches tearing at his jacket, his camera bag banging against his hip. He no longer cared about following trails or maintaining direction. He needed to get away from that clearing, from the impossible handprint, from whatever was beginning to surface through the snow. He found his car by pure luck or instinct, keys shaking as he started the engine. The heater couldn't warm him during the drive back to Bar Harbor. He packed that night, left before dawn, drove straight through to Boston without stopping. But he'd been home for a week now, and things weren't right. His apartment felt shifted furniture in slightly wrong positions. His developed photographs from Acadia, showing scenes he didn't remember shooting. Empty clearings filled with handprints, all facing upward, all wet despite the frozen ground. And when it snowed here yesterday, he looked out his window to see footprints in the courtyard below. Two sets walking side by side. One matched his boots. The other set walked backward, maintaining perfect pace. This morning, he found a wet handprint on his bathroom mirror, too large to be his, facing outward as if pressed from the other side of the glass. The condensation wouldn't wipe away. When he breathed on it, letters appeared in the fog coordinates. They pointed to a place deep in Acadia's interior, a spot that didn't appear on any trail map. He knew he shouldn't go back. He knew whatever left those prints, whatever edited his footsteps into arrows, whatever reached up through the snow, it was waiting for him. But he also knew that the footprints outside his apartment were getting closer each night. The backward walker was patient, but not infinitely so. Tomorrow, he'd return to Acadia. He'd follow those coordinates to whatever clearing or cave or impossible space they marked, because the truth he'd been avoiding since that night was simple. He never actually left the clearing. Some part of him was still there, kneeling in the snow, hand hovering over that wet print, forever about to make contact. The him that drove home, that's been living this past week, he was the reflection from the water. He was what looked back, and the real him, the one still frozen in that moment of almost touching, needed to complete the gesture. He needed to reach down into the warm water and pull out whatever was waiting beneath. When he did, when they finally touched palm to palm through that impossible surface, he'd understand why the footprints followed, why they walked backward, why they knew his gait so perfectly. He'd understand why the snow never quite covered them, why the water never quite froze, why the handprint faced upward like an invitation, or a warning, or both. The forecast showed heavy snow for Acadia that weekend. Perfect conditions for photography, perfect conditions for disappearing. He charged his camera batteries and cleaned his lenses, though he suspected he wouldn't be taking any pictures. Whatever happened in that clearing, whatever exchange took place through the melted snow, it wasn't meant to be documented. He left this account as evidence, or explanation, or apology. If someone found it, they should know that the footprints you see in winter might not all belong to the living. Sometimes we follow ourselves in circles that exist outside of normal space. Sometimes, when you find a handprint in the snow, wet and warm and impossible, you should never, ever reach back. But you will, just as he must, because that's what the followed do. We complete the circuit, close the loop, reach through the reflection to grasp whatever waits beneath. The snow was falling now. Time to go. The motel installation, when the room learns you what. If the most unsettling thing about a cheap motel room isn't the stains on the carpet or the flickering lights, but the sense that the room itself is watching you, what if, as you go about your nightly rituals, something on the other side of the wall is learning your habits, copying your routines, and slowly, methodically, installing pieces of your life in places they shouldn't be? In the endless sameness of America's roadside motels, one traveling salesman discovered that the real danger isn't what's outside your door, but what's waiting in the walls, patient, persistent, and always just a knock away. This is the story of a man on the road, a series of impossible knocks in a motel room that seemed to know him better than he knew himself. It's a story about the rituals we use to keep ourselves sane and what happens when those rituals are used against us. It started, as these stories often do, with exhaustion. He'd been on the road for 6 days, working his way through the Southwest Territory, hawking industrial cleaning supplies to restaurants and hotels. The Desert Palm Motel was the kind of place you only stopped at when everything else was full or your expense account had run dry. His had done both. The neon sign out front advertised color TV and air condition like they were still selling points worth mentioning. Half the letters didn't light up anymore. He checked in late. The manager, a gaunt man with tobacco-stained fingers and eyes that never quite met his. The man handed him the key to room 12 with something approaching relief. Said he was the only guest tonight, business being what it was. The economy, the manager muttered. Though the motel looked like it had been dying long before any recession. He entered the room, dropped his sample case by the door, and began his nightly ritual. Wallet, keys, lighter on the nightstand, phone charging on the desk. Sample case locked and positioned against the door. A traveling salesman develops rituals. They're the only constants when home becomes a series of identical rooms. He arranged his belongings in the precise order he always kept them, then sat on the sagging bed, sales reports scattered across the faded floral comforter, and tried to calculate commissions on the calculator app of his phone. The numbers blurred together. Too many days of the same motel, the same pitches, the same rejection. At 11:47 p.m., the first knock came. 3 soft taps against the shared wall, deliberate and measured, then silence. A silence so complete it seemed to swallow the hum of the struggling air conditioner and the distant whine of trucks on Interstate 40. He sat up, waiting. The fluorescent light above flickered, casting his shadow in duplicate against the wood paneling. Nothing. He returned to his paperwork, but the sense of being watched lingered. At 12:47 a.m., the knocks returned. 3 taps. Same rhythm, same pause after. This time, he pressed his ear against the wall. The surface felt oddly warm, almost humid, like breath against cold glass. He could hear nothing from the other side. No television murmur, no snoring, no toilet flush, just his own pulse thundering in his ears. He knocked back 3 times, matching the pattern. Silence.sleep came fitfully, interrupted by dreams of water dripping in reverse upward into faucets that shouldn't exist. When he awoke at 6 a.m., his cigarette lighter had moved, not far, just from the nightstand to the bathroom counter. It sat there, centered perfectly on a small puddle of water, droplets still beating on its metal surface like it had been recently washed. He hadn't been in the bathroom since before bed. The rational part of his brain, the part that had to function to make sales and navigate unfamiliar cities, offered explanations. Sleepwalking, maybe. Stress from the road, too many gas station burritos, and too much bad coffee. But his hands shook as he picked up the lighter, and the tremor had nothing to do with caffeine withdrawal. The day passed in a blur of failed pitches. The restaurant owners and Flagstaff weren't interested, claimed they had suppliers they'd worked with for years. The hotel manager took his card, but he could see it heading for the trash before he'd even left the lobby. By the time he returned to the Desert Palm, the sun was setting, painting the desert in shades of dried blood. The manager was still at his post, hadn't seemed to move at all. When he asked about the room next to his room 11, the man's jaw worked like he was chewing something bitter. Empty, he said, not looking up from a crossword puzzle that looked older than the motel itself. Been empty for months. I heard knocking last night on the wall, the salesman said. The manager's pen stopped moving. Pipes, he said. Old building. Pipes knock sometimes, but pipes didn't knock in patterns. Pipes didn't pause, then repeat. That night, he was ready. He arranged his belongings carefully, wallet, keys, lighter on the nightstand, phone charging on the desk, sample case locked and positioned against the door. If anything moved, he'd know. The knocking started earlier this time. 10:47 p.m. 3 taps. Pause. He didn't respond, just watched the wall like it might reveal something. At 11:47, they came again. This time, he noticed something else's smell. Faint but unmistakable. Soap. Not the harsh industrial kind the motel provided, but something familiar, something specific. His soap. The artisanal cedar and sage bar his ex had gotten him started on, the one luxury he allowed himself on the road. It was sitting in his bathroom, he was sure of it, but the smell was coming from the wall, from the other side. He stood, pressed both palms against the paneling. It was warm again, warmer than before, and he swore he could feel a pulse beneath the surface. Not mechanical, not pipes expanding with hot water, but something organic, something waiting. The knocks came again at 12:47, and this time his keys were gone. He tore the room apart, checked under the bed, behind the television, in every drawer. They were nowhere. Then he heard the distinctive jingle of his keychain, a small compass his daughter had given him, coming from the bathroom. There they were, sitting in the sink, wet, gleaming under the harsh fluorescent light. Water droplets covered them like they'd been carefully, methodically washed. He grabbed his phone to call who? The police, to report that his belongings were being mysteriously cleaned. The manager, who clearly knew more than he was saying, but would offer nothing but lies about pipes. Instead, he opened his laptop and searched for information about the Desert Palm Motel. He found old reviews, mostly complaints about the smell and the stains. But buried in a travel forum from 3 years ago, he found something that made his skin crawl. A woman had stayed in room 12. She'd reported the same knocking pattern, the same objects moving, always ending up in the bathroom, always wet. She'd demanded a room change, been moved to room 8. The forum post ended with her saying she'd found her own hairbrush, the one she'd been using for 15 years, with her specific hair still tangled and it sealed inside the toilet tank of the new room, like it had been installed there, waiting for her. The knocking started again, but it wasn't 1:47. It was 12:23. The pattern was changing, or he was losing track of time. 3 knocks, but the pause was shorter. Impatient, he stood in the center of the room, watching his belongings, waiting for them to move. The air felt thick, pressing against his eardrums. Every surface in the room seemed to gleam with a thin film of moisture, though the desert air outside was bone dry. His reflection in the bathroom mirror looked wrong. Not distorted exactly, but like it was a half-second behind his movements. Then he heard it not knocking this time, but running water. From the other side of the wall, the sound of a bathtub filling. He pressed his ear to the wall again, and this time he heard more splashing. The specific sound of hands being washed, that particular rhythm of lathering soap. Then, and this is what made him pull away, humming, low, tuneless, but unmistakably human, or something trying to be human. His sample case was moving, not dramatically, not sliding across the floor like something from a movie. Just small shifts, maybe an inch at a time, toward the bathroom. He watched it, transfixed, as it made its slow journey across the worn carpet. When it reached the bathroom threshold, it stopped. He approached carefully, as if it might suddenly spring to life. Inside the bathroom, the sink was full of water, not running. The faucet was off, but full to the brim. Floating in it were things that shouldn't be there. His business cards, fanned out like dead fish. His sample bottles uncapped, their contents creating an oily rainbow on the surface. And at the bottom, barely visible through the murky water, something that looked like his soap bar. But it was wrong. Too large, like multiple bars had been pressed together into one impossible mass. The knocking came again. Not from the wall this time, but from under the floor. 3 taps right beneath where he stood. The pause, then 3 more. The pattern was calling to him, or calling to something. He ran, grabbed his phone and car keys still wet, always wet. Nan fled the room. The manager wasn't at his desk. The lobby was dark, except for the vending machine glow. He hammered the bell until the man emerged from a back room, looking even more hollow than before. "I need a different room," he said, trying to keep the panic from his voice. "Something's wrong with room 12. The manager studied him for a long moment, then reached behind him without looking, pulled a key from the pegboard. "Room 8. No charge for the inconvenience," he said, and his smile was all teeth and no warmth. Room 8 was on the other side of the motel, facing the highway instead of the desert. It looked identical to room 12, same furniture, same arrangement, same stale smell of cigarettes and disappointment. He dropped his belongings on the bed and went straight to the bathroom. The toilet tank lid was slightly askew. His hands trembled as he lifted it. The mechanism inside looked normal float chain. Flapper valve butt wedged behind the overflow tube was something wrapped in plastic. He pulled it free, water sloshing onto the floor. Inside the plastic was a bar of soap, cedar, and sage. His brand, his specific type, but he'd never opened this one. The wrapper was intact, pristine, like it had just come from the store, except for one detail that made his knees buckle. There were indentations in the bar finger marks, the exact pattern of his grip, the way he held it every morning in the shower, the unique wear pattern that only his hands could make, as if something had been studying him, learning him, preparing this offering, installing it. He sat on the bathroom floor, holding this impossible soap as water dripped from the tank onto his hands. The water was warm too warm for a toilet tank, body temperature. From somewhere the walls, the pipes, the space between spaces came. 3 soft knocks, a pause, then 3 more, then a new sound, the squeak of a faucet turning, but not in his room. In all the rooms, a chorus of running water, of things being washed, being prepared. He understood then, with the clarity that comes from accepting the impossible. This wasn't about the motel. The motel was just the current location. Whatever was doing this, washing his things, learning his patterns, installing pieces of his life in places they shouldn't be, had been following him. How many motels had he stayed in? How many rooms? How many times had he dismissed a misplaced item as forgetfulness? The knocking came again, louder now, from every wall, not demanding entry, confirming installation. He was still in room 8. It was 3:47 a.m. as he wrote this on his phone, sitting in his car in the parking lot, engine running. He could see his reflection in the rearview mirror, and he looked exactly like himself. Exactly like something studied him and got every detail right, but doesn't understand why those details matter. The soap was still in his pocket. He couldn't bring himself to throw it away. It smelled like him, like his specific chemistry mixed with cedar and sage, like proof that something had been collecting him, piece by piece, drop by drop. Tomorrow, he'd drive to the next town, check into another motel. He'd arrange his belongings in the same order. It was his ritual, his constant, and he'd wait for the knocking. 3 taps, pause, 3 taps, because now he understood what the pause was for. It wasn't waiting for a response. It was making room for the next installation. The Desert Palm Motel shrank in his rearview mirror, but he could still smell cedar and sage. His hands on the steering wheel were clean, too clean, like they'd just been washed, like something else washed them for him, through him, as him. 3 exits to the next town, 3 taps on the wheel as he drove. Pause. The installation continued. The breathing theater, when the building remembers you. What if the most haunted place in your city isn't a graveyard or a crumbling hospital, but a theater? Not the kind of place you'd expect to find ghosts, just velvet seats, faded curtains, and the echo of applause from decades past. But what if, as you walk the corridors beneath the stage, you realize the building itself is watching you, learning you, and waiting for you to play a part you never auditioned for? What if the walls remember every name, every echo, every step end? The costume you find in the dark is already tailored to fit. This is the story of a lighting tech hired to help reopen a historic theater, and the impossible maze he found beneath the stage. It's a story about the way old buildings breathe, the way the past can reach through the present, and the moment you realize you're not just working in the theater, you're part of the show. It started, as these stories often do, with a job. The Orpheum sat on the corner of 7th and Main like a forgotten mausoleum, its Art Deco facade crumbling behind scaffolding. The grand reopening was supposed to be a triumphant chance for the city to reclaim a piece of its golden age. The pay was good enough that the lighting tech didn't ask questions about why the previous guy had quit after just 2 days, leaving only a note that said, "The angles are wrong." He figured it was about the lighting angles. He was wrong. Inside, the main auditorium still held hints of its 1920s grandeur gilt moldings. Velvet seats gone, threadbare, a ceiling painted with constellations that had faded to the color of old tea. But it was the basement that concerned him. That's where all the electrical panels lived, where the old carbon arc follow spots were stored, where he'd need to run new cable for the LED system. The blueprints showed a simple layout: storage rooms, the old coal cellar converted to electrical, a few dressing rooms from when the orchestra pit could be lowered to create understage space for quick changes. Clean, logical, boring. The reality was different. He discovered the first impossible corridor on a Tuesday afternoon. He'd been following what should have been a straight path, from the electrical room to the old wardrobe storage when the hallway curved. Not dramatically, just a subtle arc that shouldn't have been there. The fluorescent work lights he'd strung up buzzed overhead, casting everything in that sick greenish pallor that makes your skin look dead. He checked his phone's compass app. North stayed north, but the corridor kept bending. At first, he thought he'd simply misread the plans. Old buildings settle, walls get moved, renovations happen, off record. But when he turned around to go back, the curve led him to the main corridor, again the same main corridor he'd started from, even though he'd never made a complete turn. The geometry didn't work, couldn't work. The dust was thick down there, decades of it layered like geological strata. His footprints were clear in its size 11 work boots, making sharp impressions. But there were other marks too. Footprints that seemed to follow his, step for step. But the dust in them was already dry and settled, as if they'd been made days ago. They were always one stride ahead of wherever he went, like someone was walking backward in front of him, perfectly matching his pace. He started mapping the corridors, using spray paint to mark the walls orange arrows pointing back toward the stairs, numbers to identify each turn. It didn't help. The passages rearranged themselves when he wasn't looking, or maybe they stayed the same and he was the one being rearranged. Either way, he'd follow his own arrows and end up somewhere impossible. Staring at a number he'd sprayed on a completely different wall. The wardrobe storage room became his fixation. According to the blueprints, it should have been a large space near the northwest corner of the basement. He could never find the northwest corner. Every path he took led him back to the main corridor or to other storage rooms filled with moldering scripts and broken stage machinery, but never to wardrobe storage. Yet, he could smell it naphthalene mothballs, that sharp chemical temps that gets in your nose and stays there. The smell grew stronger near certain walls, like it was seeping through from somewhere just beyond. His flashlight started dying near those walls. Not gradually, the batteries would just drain in seconds, LEDs fading from brilliant white to amber to nothing. He started carrying extras, but it didn't matter. The darkness down there was hungry. 3 weeks in, he heard the whispers. They started when he was alone, running cable through the spaces between walls. Just syllables at first, too soft to make out, like someone talking in the next room with their mouth pressed against the wallpaper. He'd stop, hold his breath, strain to listen. Nothing. But the moment he went back to work, there they were, energent and unintelligible, growing louder when he got close to certain spots, always near where the mothball smell was strongest. He tried recording them with his phone. The playback gave him nothing but static and his own breathing, though he swore he could see his breath misting in the camera footage, even though the basement was warm, stuffy. Even the time stamp on the videos was wrong too. He'd record for 5 minutes and the file would show 30 seconds. Or he'd record for 10 seconds and get an hour of footage, an hour of him standing perfectly still, staring at something just outside the frame while his breath came in rapid, shallow gasps he didn't remember taking. The break-in happened on a Thursday, or at least that's what the security company called it. He'd locked up the night before, set the alarm, driven home to his apartment across town. But when he arrived the next morning, his personal toolbox was in the basement, moved from the truck where he always kept it. The lock wasn't broken. The alarm hadn't triggered. But there it was, sitting in the middle of the main corridor. Tools arranged neatly beside it. like someone had been taking inventory. That's when he found the first note, tucked under his wire strippers. The coat room remembers. He knew he should quit. Pack up, walk out, let someone else deal with whatever was happening in that basement. But the money was too good, and more than that, he needed to understand. The impossibility of it gnawed at him. Buildings don't reshape themselves. Footprints don't appear ahead of you. Whispers don't come from inside walls. He started staying later, bringing camping gear so he could spend whole nights in the basement. He set up motion sensors, infrared cameras, electromagnetic field detectors borrowed from a friend who investigated hauntings for a living. The friend laughed when he asked for them, said the Orpheum was famous in certain circles. That place has been eating people since the 1940s, he said, still chuckling. Not literally, mind you. They just go when normal and come out different, if they come out at all. The equipment showed him nothing conclusive. Temperature readings that didn't match what his skin felt. Magnetic anomalies that moved like someone pacing. The infrared showed heat signatures in rooms he knew were empty, human-shaped but too tall, too thin, joints bending in too many places. But when he checked the rooms, there was never anything there except the smell of mothballs. Growing stronger, he finally found the wardrobe storage on his 31st night in the basement. He wasn't even looking for it. He'd been following new cable runs, checking connections. When he turned a corner, he'd turned 100 times before. There it was, a heavy wooden door with a brass nameplate that read, "Wardrobe and costumes" in that elaborate 1920s script. The room beyond was vast, far larger than the blueprint suggested. Racks of costumes stretched back into darkness, organized by era, by production, by some system he couldn't parse. The mothball smell was overwhelming, sharp enough to make his eyes water, but it was the movement that stopped his breath. Every rack was turning slowly, hangers swaying like pendulums. They'd rotate a few degrees, pause, continue. All of them synchronized in a pattern that hurt to follow with his eyes. As he watched, they all stopped at once. Every hanger on every rack pointed toward a single costume rack near the back. The silence was complete. Even the omnipresent hum of the building's electricity had stopped. He walked toward the indicated rack, his footsteps impossibly loud on the concrete floor. Each step echoed wrong, coming back to him from directions that shouldn't exist. The rack held period costumes, 1940s by the look of them. Men's suits, military uniforms, evening wear. But there was a gap, an empty space where something heavy had hung. The wooden bar was still indented from the weight, and there were a few threads caught on the metal hanger. Dark wool, quality fabric, an overcoat, maybe. That's when he noticed the label on the empty hanger, written in fountain pen on a yellowed card. Mr. Henderson, stage 1943. His name was Henderson. He never told anyone at the theater his last name. He was just the lighting tech, paid under the table, no paperwork. But there it was, in ink that looked fresh, despite the aged paper. The whispers started again, louder now, resolving into words he could almost understand. They seemed to come from inside the costumes themselves, as if the fabric was speaking. He leaned closer, straining to hear, and finally made out a single phrase, repeated over and over. "You're wearing it now. You're wearing it now. You're wearing it now." He looked down at himself, fat as work clothes, his jeans and flannel shirt. But in the dim light, just for a moment, he saw something else. A dark wool overcoat, heavy and well-made. The kind they wore in the 1940s. The kind that would leave an indent on a wooden bar if it hung there for decades. He ran, stumbled through the darkness, followed his spray-painted arrows that now all pointed in different directions, crashed through passages that folded in on themselves. Somehow, he found the stairs, burst out into the lobby, where the morning sun was streaming through the restored stained glass. The security guard looked at him strangely, but didn't say a word. He tried to quit the next day, but the project manager just smiled and said, "We're almost done. Just a few more nights." He went home, but the smell of mothballs followed him. His clothes, his hair, even his skin seemed to carry it. He found a button in his pocket hole black, engraved with a tiny O. He didn't own any clothes with buttons like that. He started dreaming of the theater, not the restored version, but the way it must have looked in the 1940s. Smoke curling in the lobby, ushers in pressed uniforms, the sound of an orchestra tuning up. In the dreams, he was always backstage, waiting for his cue, wearing the overcoat. The whispers were there too, but now they were instructions, places, lights up, curtain. He tried to stay away, but every morning he found himself back at the Orpheum, unlocking the side door, descending into the basement. The corridors seemed to shift more each night, the dust thicker, the footprints more numerous. Sometimes he saw other figures in the darkness, shadows in period dress, faces blurred, moving with the slow, deliberate grace of actors waiting for their scene. He started finding more notes, tucked into his toolbox, slipped under the door of the lighting booth, taped to the back of the follow spot. "The show must go on. We remember. You're in the program now." The handwriting was always different, but the message was the same. The final night of the install. He arrived early, determined to finish and leave for good. The basement was colder than usual, the air heavy with the scent of mothballs and something older dust, sweat, fear. He followed the cables, checking connections, when he heard the sound of applause, faint at first, then growing louder, echoing through the concrete like water in pipes. He followed the sound to the wardrobe room. The door was open, the racks turning slowly, hangers swaying in time with the applause. In the center of the room, a single costume hung on the empty rack, a dark wool overcoat, freshly pressed, a program tucked into the pocket. He pulled it out. The cover read, Orpheum Theater, 1943, The Winter's Guest, starring Mr. Henderson. He put on the coat. It fit perfectly, heavy on his shoulders, warm despite the chill. The applause faded, replaced by whispers, places, lights up, curtain. He walked to the stage, climbed the stairs, and found himself not in the modern auditorium, but in the past. The seats were full, the orchestra tuning up, the footlights blazing. He stepped into the spotlight, and the audience leaned forward, waiting. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words weren't his. They were lines he'd never learned, a script he'd never seen. He performed, moving through the scenes with a confidence that wasn't his own. The audience applauded, the curtain fell, and he found himself back in the basement, the overcoat gone, the program crumbling to dust in his hand. He left the theater that night, but the show never really ended. He found himself reciting lines in his sleep, waking with the taste of mothballs in his mouth. His clothes would disappear from his closet, only to reappear days later, pressed and folded, smelling of the Orpheum. Sometimes, when he passed a mirror, he'd catch a glimpse of himself in the overcoat, just for a moment, before it faded. He tried to warn the next lighting tech, leaving a note in the follow spot. The angles are wrong. The show never ends. But he knew it wouldn't help. The Orpheum remembered everyone who worked there, everyone who wore the costumes, everyone who walked the corridors beneath the stage. The building breathed, inhaling memories, exhaling echoes. Now, when he walks past the theater at night, he can see the lights burning in the basement windows, shadows moving behind the glass. Sometimes he hears applause, faint and distant, or the sound of a voice his own, or someone else's reciting lines from a play that hasn't been performed in decades. He knows he'll go back someday. The show must go on. The program is already printed. The costume is waiting, and the Orpheum, patient and hungry, will always have a part for him to play.